you then take ownership of the harp in a new way. The harp work becomes not just, my technique has to get better, and I have to play harder pieces, or whatever the daily concerns are. It cuts you back to the most essential reasons why you got into this long journey in the first place, and that energy in you that yearns for a long journey toward the beauty you can create.
And you, of course, were there at my graduation getting a little award yourself, weren't you?
I loved that moment. That was one of life's great treats. You don't get many of those in life. It was so happy. To create an environment where success is not limited to high technical achievement, but is brought to the sheer beauty and wonder of playing, notice the word playing, an instrument. Heather, this is the best stuff in the world. We could talk about this all day long. And I'm so glad you've gathered a community that cares about these issues too, because we are more important in the world than we usually give ourselves credit for.
Welcome to the How to Harp podcast, where your harp, your journey are always front and centre. I'm Heather Downey, harpist and founder of How to Harp, your online space for expert guidance and endless inspiration. Each week, we are here to empower, inspire, and encourage you, whether you're just beginning or many years into your harp adventure. From chats with world-class professionals to real stories from everyday harpists to practical tips you can use right away. This podcast is all about helping you feel happy, confident, and fulfilled with your harp. This is episode 18 of the How to Harp podcast, and this one is a little bit different because I am not interviewing a harpist. Instead, I'm speaking with someone whose work had a huge impact on me during my Masters in Learning and Teaching the Arts, the incredible Dr. Eric Booth. If you don't already know Eric, he's widely recognised as one of the leading voices in the world of teaching artistry. He began his career as a Broadway actor before devoting the last 50 years to the work of the teaching artist. An artist who also specialises in the craft of education and bringing people into meaningful artistic experience. I first discovered Eric's work whilst I was studying for my Masters, and I very quickly became a bit of a fangirl. His writing and ideas had a huge influence on how I think about learning, teaching, creativity, and the role of arts in our lives. At first glance, his work might seem like it would only be worthwhile for those of you who might be interested in teaching, but please don't make this assumption. Everyone who is learning is also a teacher, especially learning in an online space. You are your own teacher. Understanding ourselves as learners and our own teachers is key to successful harp learning. I love his work, so to sit down with him for this conversation was an absolute honour. Hello, Eric. Thank you so much for joining us on this podcast.
Heather, it's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm so delighted to have you. Now, actually, should I be calling you Dr. Eric Booth, or is Eric good enough?
Eric is the only name I answer to.
Okay, we can go with that. And I have to say, before we jump into the main body of our podcast, that I've been a big fan of your work for a long time. And the membership have already heard me talk a lot about how much I've learned from your work, especially during my Masters study. And you, of course, were there at my graduation getting a little award yourself, weren't you?
I loved that moment. That was one of life's great treats. You don't get many of those in life. It was so happy.
Oh, it was lovely. I was so glad that we could share that. That was really nice. So, we're going to go right back to the beginning, right back to the start, and how you got interested, not only in, of course, teaching, which we're going to talk a lot about, but actually just in the creative arts. So can you take us back to the beginning, Eric, and tell us about how you got into your area of creative artistry?
Sure. Wow, an invitation to talk about my journey. What could be better? I'll start with the young part of it. I had a family who had involvement in the arts. In fact, my very first childhood memory was my mom was getting a master's degree in theater, and at one rehearsal, I was allowed to go on stage and answer the phone. And so my very first childhood memory is being on stage as an actor. And throughout my childhood, I would say the arts were involved, but much more the active word was make stuff I care about. In the day that we didn't watch television and we lived in the countryside. And so I was just always making stuff and if I told my mom I was bored, she would say, shut up, go make something. And so this notion of self-generated creating things you cared about was in my bloodstream. And in college, I got cast in a play and immediately decided I want to pursue acting, and followed the actor's pathway right up to a career as a Broadway actor. And it was going great. It was like what an artist is supposed to want, until I discovered I didn't love it. I didn't love the life of a professional actor with soap operas and agents and TV commercials. And so while I was doing it, I was looking for something that would bring greater fulfillment. And I heard about this thing called teaching artists and went to a workshop and was so immediately delighted with the satisfaction, the fascination of bringing people into the art form rather than doing the same show 8 times a week. I found myself turning in that direction and managing a career that went back and forth between being the performing artist and being the teaching artist. And then I got so interested in the teaching artist thing, the performing part fell away. And for 50 years, I've been practicing the work of a teaching artist.
Wow, amazing. What a fantastic story. So, since you came from the background of, being on the stage and being an actor, I'm interested to know how much of your work, what percentage of the work you did then would you say was research-based? Because I know that a lot of the stuff you've done for the teaching artist and your publications and all this, you've done lots and lots of research, of course. So is this something you found out you were interested in after your career in the stage, the research part? Or were you researching whilst you were kind of a creative artist practitioner?
I would say that the teaching artist part and the inquiry into it was natural to my deepest interests in art. It was, I had enjoyed the performing part of it, but I enjoyed the rehearsing more. And I enjoyed the interface with audiences more than just putting it out. So it was a natural extension. And it changed particularly when I was hired to start Juilliard's teaching artist program. And I was pulled into the strange subculture of classical music, which still seems like a strange subculture to me, I must say. But I learned to create a language that goes across art forms. It's not informed by the particularities of musical challenges, which are, I would say, different than the challenges of both education and learning in the other art forms. And so my research has really been trying to find what is the language for introducing an art form, what is the journey of learning as a self-directed learner in the art form? And how do you connect that sort of high-end performance with the organic end of a learner? So those are the questions that have driven my curiosity and experimentation for 50 years.
Amazing. That's fantastic. Okay, we're going to share a little clip. We're going to go back in time a little bit. We just have a little bit of a giggle about this. We're going to share a little clip about you talking about the teaching artist, and then we can talk a little bit more about that concept.
What is a teaching artist? And I wish I had a nifty little one-sentence answer for you, but as a field, we haven't come to agreement. In fact, even the definition of this entity is changing fast. As of 5 years ago, even the term teaching artist probably wouldn't have been generally agreed upon. But it's become a term of consensus, and it's actually become an understanding of a profession in the field. And I have a hunch there's a secret bias that we don't want a refined definition, that it needs to have a little bit of play for participants to make of it what they want, because it isn't a particular kind of job. It's more a way of thinking and functioning. But let me give you a few pieces that seem to have general agreement. That a teaching artist is an active artist and has dedicated a significant portion of her passion and expertise to learning the skills of an educator. I've heard teaching artists described as artists in the artistic medium of learning. I've heard them described as people with a gift for bringing people inside artistic experiences. Whatever your particular definition or slant you want to run with, the key thing is that there are two and equal bodies of expertise that for an awful lot of decades were thought of as separate domains, that housed in the teaching artist are intentionally combined, so that you have the skills of the artist and the skills of the educator working together in some kind of dynamic excitement.
So, two bodies coming together as one for the teaching artist. Why is it so important that we have these two elements to have an effective teaching artist?
I can give you a very simple example from El Sistema Venezuela, this amazing national system of youth ensemble learning. And there is a phrase they use with early learners in their orchestral program, and it is, if you know how to play 4 notes, it is your responsibility to teach your friend who only knows 3. And as you're teaching your friend the 4th note, you become more ready to learn your 5th. I think there is something profoundly healthy in the back and forth of developing your own artistry and sharing what you know as a learner with others. I see the ideal teaching artist career as going back and forth, that what you learn as a teacher excites new discoveries about what it's like to learn in this art form, and those inform your performance as you enrich your performance with greater sensitivity for what it's like for non-performers to come into the music that you offer. And conversely, what you're excited about as a performer enriches the way you draw people into the art form. So there's this healthy synergy that can carry for a lifetime. And I feel either of those roles is lessened if you do not have the other one present.
That was such a wonderful and nice and simple description as well. And I'm so glad that you actually made it so clear, because I'm often telling our audience, our members, how important it is that they that I share what I'm learning as a teacher, and how important it is that they understand why we do things and why I'm teaching them in certain ways, and the kind of theories behind how I'm sharing things, and they actually think about teaching. And even having you as a member, why are we having someone in who's interested in teaching theory? We're all learners, but you just perfectly explained why it's so important for our learners to think about those things.
There's one other benefit, which is the expert musician is rather internalized in their pleasures, and the learner is more externalized in their excitement, their discovery, their learning. And I find too many musicians are, and I'll use this phrase, not radiant with the benefits of a life in music. They're not overtly joyful. In fact, I remember preparing a group of kids to come see the New York Philharmonic. And we did a whole bunch of preparations. And then the kids came to see the performance at the big performance hall. And the first thing one kid said to me afterwards was, "Why are the musicians so sad?" That there was nothing joyful, there was nothing extroverted about their sharing the pleasures. And when you're in direct contact with learners, that kind of radiance of the pleasure and the value of being inside music is much more present in the room.
And this is getting me so excited, because you've also just put into words something that I've never been able to explain to anyone, and that is that every kind of 3 years, William, every 3 years I learn a new instrument. Not because I want to teach it, not because I want to perform it, but because I feel like it makes me a better teacher of the instrument I am an expert on, which is the harp. And I've never really actually been able to put into words why I feel like it helps so much. I always kind of like, well, it reminds me what it's like to learn, and it reminds me that, but actually it's a joyous experience. It reignites that joy of learning.
Exactly. Well, you are clearly a natural teaching artist. I always say teaching artists are expert at remembering what it's like to experience something for the first time. And when you have that empathetic connection to the wonder, the power, just the sheer delightfulness of music, when you have an active relationship to that, you are both more powerful as a teacher and you're more powerful as a performer. And I've always found that the more advanced in careers that musicians tend to get, they tend to get further away from the abundant sharing of all that positiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Okay, so we're going to try and really ask some more deep questions to really help our listeners understand how they can engage with your work and how they can apply it to their own experiences. So, something that you have said is that teaching something is one of the best ways to strengthen one's learning. So I'm interested to know, what happens inside a musician's or an artist's brain when they're trying to explain a tricky concept or a tricky topic?
Let me start with an example outside of music. When I'm working with new teaching artists, one of the exercises I have them do, and your listening audience can try this out, is to think of a time when they learned something complicated over time outside of music, and they learned it because they loved doing it. And to think about that journey and what helped them in that journey, what kept them going, how did people help them, how did people get in the way? And then to think about, how would you bring someone else into that journey in a way that invites them to be excited and enthusiastic. And one of the things that requires of thinking is you distill down to core elements that are perennial truths of that art form. You go back to basics. There's this wonderful arts education philosopher, Elliot Eisner, who said, one thing the arts do better than anything else, and particularly music, is sharpen the understanding of the relationship between parts and wholes. And teaching any art form is really a masterclass in how to connect the big, important, crucial elements of your art form with the particulars of technique and understanding and learning about the art form, and that going back and forth, which psychologists call transcendent thinking, is at the heart of strong communication and passionate learning. When you are sharing the particulars, but they're in relation to why it matters and why it's big in the world and how it matters in life, that is the gift to the learner. And it's the gift to the teacher because it reminds you of the importance and the essentials.
Amazing. And do you know, I kind of feel like in answering that question, you've almost answered the next one, which was, if a harpist was to teach one simple skill to a friend, what might they discover in the process about their own playing? You've kind of just answered it, really.
It kind of is. And, following that up, what would you choose to teach? And why do you choose to teach that? There's embedded in answering those questions are your lifetime relationship to the harp. And by reflecting on your lifetime relationship and making a choice of an entry point, you then take ownership of the harp in a new way. The harp work becomes not just, my technique has to get better, and I have to play harder pieces, or whatever the daily concerns are. It cuts you back to the most essential reasons why you got into this long journey in the first place, and that energy in you that yearns for a long journey toward the beauty you can create.
And so actually, something we could maybe encourage the audience to do, you don't even have to it would be great to do the act of teaching a simple skill to a friend, but even just the thought process of thinking, what would I teach and how might I teach that, would be a useful thing for them to do, even if they don't have someone close to them that they maybe do want to teach that skill to.
You know what, Heather, I'll take your raise and raise you one. I think even the thinking of the environment you want to create around the learning process matters, even more than the specific choice of what you're going to teach. What is the learning environment that you wish you had as a learner that is the optimum positive, encouraging environment? I remember a New York City violin teacher. He taught in schools all his life, and he said his wish of a lifetime is to know how to create the expectations and the environment so that the first time a kid draws a bow across a string, all that kid hears is beauty and success and hunger for the next sound she can make. Whereas instead of hearing a screechy sound that makes you think, oh my God, it's going to be years till I can make anything good come out of this box. Instead, how do you set the expectation of pleasure and delight and success that is genuine? It's not phony encouragement. It's wonder and it's delight-based. And how do you set that up with your learners? It's entirely possible in a teacher's technique to create an environment where success is not limited to high technical achievement, but is brought to the sheer beauty and wonder of playing. Notice the word playing an instrument.
Yeah, playing an instrument. Even just you saying that, playing an instrument, and so often, we just mess that word up, don't we? How often are we no longer playing with our instrument? It's in the word, the joy, the freedom, the inhibitions, but we're always putting ourselves in a box. Do you know why we do that as adult learners?
I don't mean to condemn the traditional teaching methods, but the notion that the success is determined by technical advancement, by measurements of technical ability, narrows the range of play and pleasure and exploration. There's still pleasures down that channel, but they are much fewer than the range of pleasures that are available to those exploring in music. And I think there's a way as a direct teacher of another person. And even when you're learning online, to remember that it's about beauty and pleasure and not about technical accomplishment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, one of the things that's really important to us in How to Harp, both for me and the team who are creating How to Harp, and I like to think for the members as well, is the community. So we have our online community, and we really like to encourage people to share their highs and their lows and, their learning and everything on their journey in the community. So do you think that this is what you're talking about, creating this environment, this community of sharing? Like, can you comment a little bit about community and learning and its importance?
Most learning in life that is a complex challenge, like developing skill on an instrument, is done better in community. The work can be so isolating. Even teaching artist work can be isolating, and how different it feels when you're with colleagues who are sharing the ups and downs of the journey, but also sharing the inquiry process, the figuring it out process. You can follow a rote program. I've written online courses and they were way too dry. People were following a rote program. But when people are engaged with one another, they remember it's this huge musical world that has been around since humans became humans, and that it's our opportunity to join with others in, kind of the embodied challenge of our lifetimes. One of the beautiful things about harp is how physical it is. I mean, it's holistic in its learning. It's not dry and narrow. It's a whole body invitation. And so there's the dance element to it, and there's the spiritual element to it when you're enough on top of your technique that you can start opening to the heart of the work. And that requires colleagues, that requires people to share in what you're aiming for, which is sharing the beauty this instrument can provide.
Absolutely. And you commented there about the world. And so I'd like to just maybe ask you to comment about a book that people can access of yours, which is called Making Change, Teaching Artists and Their Role in Shaping a Better World. Can you talk a little bit about that work? And whilst you are, we'll bring up your website on screen so that people know where they can get hold of this.
Well, thank you for reminding your audience. So this is a book I wrote because there's so little visibility for the term teaching artist. In the UK, it's often referred to as participatory artist. In other countries, social practice artist, community artist. But this role where your number one job is to activate the artistry of other people. And in this book, I sort of describe the enormous impact of this invisible field, which has power both to bring people into richer journeys of learning an instrument or an art form, but even more is a powerful tool in social change. I refer to teaching artistry, whatever its title, as the sleeping giant of social change, because when teaching artistry is allowed to reach into health outcomes, as in social prescribing or dealing with health issues, when it's allowed to reach into environmental response, it has huge impact. So teaching artistry writ large is first introduced in this small book. And if any listeners are interested in finding out the techniques or the kind of omnipresence of this practice, if they go to the book's website, they can even get free or at cost copies of this book, because it's really a calling card for an invisible field that has so much potential.
Amazing. That's so good. That's amazing. I mean, it's interesting because as you're talking about this, I have to be honest and say that part of me as a teaching artist gets really fired up and excited and there's so many things, but the little bit of me gets a little bit like, it's a big responsibility and there's a lot. Do you talk about that at all, about the responsibility as well as the joy?
Well, I'm a New Yorker, so I'm pretty pushy, and I'm pushing people toward more, because what often holds them back is caution and, kind of habits of being modest in one's work, and recognition that learning an instrument is a long, hard journey. And you're asking me to do more than just that? And the answer is not so much do more, but open wider what you do. The skills of an artist inform the skills of being a teaching artist. And when allowed to open a little bigger, they become the skills of a social change artist. And so the encouragement is really to honor the power of what you know and can do as an artist, and to take a little bit of that entrepreneurial edge that keeps you going as an artist and bring it further into the challenges of our neighbors and our nations.
It's very exciting, the thoughts of it all. It's really great. I'm going to bring us a little bit back down to talking about things that the listeners can apply and such like. Not that they can't apply that, of course they can, but in little steps, hey? So talking about how our listeners can really become better learners, or can help themselves in their learning journey by understanding teaching better, I'm interested in your thoughts on meaningful feedback. What does meaningful feedback look like? And how can a learner give that to themselves if they're learning in a community, but in more of a solo environment without a one-to-one teacher?
Let me start by going back to that exercise I mentioned before, where you had a long learning journey outside of the arts. And if you really pick that apart, feedback was a crucial part of getting better at bicycle riding or making bread, whatever it was. And you knew the difference between the people who gave you feedback that really helped you and people who gave you feedback that didn't really help you. The feedback from outside people that matters most is that which is empathetically attuned to your being in charge of your learning journey. That opinions and the judgments that come at you are often not very helpful. In fact, they can be hurtful. But the feedback that matters is that teacher, that friend who is attuned to what is going on in your journey and can offer those few specific pieces of information, pieces of reflection that enable you to re-engage with your own forward momentum. And in terms of self-guidance, those questions you asked yourself, learning to bake that souffle over time or learning to ride the bicycle, you were asking yourself different questions, assessing your strengths and weaknesses nonstop. And because you were urgent and taking in information from lots of different sources, you were being an effective self-guide in improvement because you were driving it. It wasn't that your teacher was driving it. It wasn't that you were following the required lesson plan. It was you were pulling in information that mattered because you were autonomously driving your learning and able to sort out the realities of how you were doing, what questions you should be asking. And you can even follow the questions that a learner asks change over time when they're noticing, okay, I've kind of answered that question, and here's the next thing I'm working on. And there's pleasure involved in that. So self-guided feedback is the self-assessment is the one that matters more than any amount of outside feedback that tells you what you should be doing.
Amazing. This is very good news for all of our listeners, of course. And this leads us really perfectly into a topic which I'm very interested in and passionate in, and I know you are too, and that is self-determined learning. So before we talk about self-determined learning. Can you maybe tell our listeners what does that mean? What is self-determined learning?
Well, I tend to use that term along with the term intrinsic motivation. And it's that the learner is driving the journey. The learner is in charge of where and how it's going. And I'll tell your listeners, there is so much research affirming that that is how humans learn best. There's no question about it, that the learner who is self-determined will go further and faster than the learner who is compliant, the learner who is following instructions, because the energy, as I'm sure listeners have felt, when you are driving it, the energy renews itself. There's a kind of self-discipline in it. Not the discipline one hears from many music teachers, which is knuckle down and do the work, get in that practice room more hours a day. That is not the self-determined listener's energy. In fact, the word discipline etymologically doesn't mean knuckle down. It means learn. That when you are learning hungry, that is when you drive faster and further because you're making so many choices. You are assessing in intimate ways all the time what improvement looks like. You go out and get a little bit of feedback that determines whether you're on the right track. But the self-determined learner who expands the kinds of pleasures he can find along the way is the learner that goes further if there's enough support. If you're entirely left alone without enough reward from experience, without enough shared connection to others to keep encouragement going, those things can deplete the self-determined learner. But if you have just enough support, and it doesn't even take a ton, you go further and faster with self-determination.
Okay. So we always finish by asking our guest artists, who, to be fair, are usually harpists, but I am sure that you have some amazing words of wisdom for us. And that is, if you could give the learner harpist, or shall we say the learning artist, one piece of advice, what would that be?
Thank you for the invitation. I am going to cite, I guess I call it a guideline for teaching artistry that I live by, and it's called the law of 80%. I call it a law to make it sound scary, and that number, 80%, creates the false impression I've done some research, which I haven't, but the law of 80% is still true, and it is 80% of what you teach is who you are. The vast majority, 80% of your potential strength in teaching someone else is the way you model being a musician in your art form and engaging with your art form. Your learners learn more from seeing you make music and figure out how to solve problems and how to take ideas from others and use them. That is where they are learning what it means to be a real musician in the world. And you're radiating pleasure at the opportunities of being a musician in the world. That is by far your largest opportunity for impact with others. So take care, protect that artist in you, because that is your strongest tool to have impact on others, to radiate what it is you want to share with the world, and in the process, keep yourself invigorated.
Amazing. Dr. Eric Booth, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast. I really can't thank you enough for giving us your time and all of your experience.
Heather, this is the best stuff in the world. We could talk about this all day long. And I'm so glad you've gathered a community that cares about these issues too, because we are more important in the world than we usually give ourselves credit for.
Thank you so much, Eric. See you very soon.
Soon.
Thank you so much to Eric for joining me on the podcast today. It was a real honour to have him, and I know so many of you will have found this conversation as inspiring and thought-provoking as I did. His work has shaped so much of my own approach to learning and teaching, so getting this chance to bring his voice directly to our harp community has been incredibly special. Next week is another one of my monthly Harpy Chat episodes with Angela, and it's actually the last one we filmed in person when she was up here visiting us in Scotland a few months ago. It's very much an end of year roundup. We look back at everything that's happened over the past year, the highs, the challenges, the unexpected moments, and then we chat about what our hopes and dreams are for the year ahead, both in our own harping and in our wider creative lives. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and I'd love you to join us again next week. And as always, it really helps if you like, follow, subscribe, leave a comment, or share this podcast with a harp friend. Anything you can do to help us grow this podcast truly means the world to us. And I'll see you all next week.